Hey, friend, welcome to a new episode of the Follow Up Question. Thank you so much for being here as we embark into 2024. Real quick, have you gotten a copy of my new book, Can I Ask a Question? It's available on my website, michaelashford.com, right now. I'm still waiting for it to be released on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, but the reviews are coming in from people who have read it, and I'm just blown away by the takeaways that people are getting from the book and the conversations that I'm getting to have because they've read it and they want to know more. They want to dig deeper. So please do me a favor, support this show, support me, support the work that I'm trying to do here, and go grab a copy for yourself. Like I said, it's available at michaelashford.com/can I ask a question. The link is in the show notes. I would be so forever grateful and appreciative if you did that. So let's get into today's episode, as always, with a question. And my question for you is, what are you most afraid of? Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. My friend, I have a feeling this conversation is going to be one heck of a wild ride for you, because I know it was for me. You're about to hear my conversation with Steije Hofhuis, a Dutch university lecturer and historian and an expert on the early modern witchcraft panics that swept across Europe in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, not unlike those that occurred in Salem, Massachusetts in the late 1600s here in the United States. Now, you might be asking, what in the world do witchcraft panics and witch trials have to do with communication? But I assure you, after hearing Steije's perspective, there will be little doubt of the linkage. You see, as Steije explains, the ways that witchcraft panics spread, they very much mimicked how a virus might sweep through a population, a notion with which we are, unfortunately, all too familiar these days. And as we've also seen, the hysteria and the fear that comes with these outbreaks, so to speak, can cause humans to do and believe some pretty incredible things. The similarities and links between the European witchcraft panics and what we are experiencing today in so many areas of our society, from politics to religion to cultural and ideological rifts, it is quite astounding once you dive into the details. And unfortunately, as Steije and I discuss, once an idea takes up residency in your mind, it can be very difficult to shake, just like a virus. And so things like confirmation bias take over, where you go looking for proof that what you believe is true and that what others believe is untrue, or vice versa. The no-win situations we twist ourselves into just to be right and certain that we're the ones who are healthy and they are the afflicted ones. They not only look foolish when seen through the 2020 perspective of hindsight, but in real time, they affect people's lives in some extremely damaging and destructive ways. I guess just how does one get into early modern witchcraft panic? I've got to understand how you actually come to find that as the thing that you study and you get involved with. Can you walk me through that?
Um, I've always been very much interested in history, already from a young age onwards. So I was very determined to study history at the university. And then I've read books about loads of things. And one of the things that fascinated me already, I think during my second year, was witch persecutions. And later on, I came across a book by a philosopher, an American philosopher, Daniel Dennett. And he said that certain cultural phenomena can evolve almost like viruses. And I got really fascinated by that idea. So I wanted to examine this as a historian. And I thought, if I really want to examine this, I need a case study. And then I thought of witch persecutions and the fact that historians already compared it to viruses or epidemic diseases quite a few times. Yeah, so I thought this is a fascinating case study. And when I delved into it, it became all the more intriguing what happened there in Europe centuries ago.
And here in the United States, we are certainly no stranger to witchcraft panic, the
No,
Salem witch trials. I don't know if you're familiar with
yeah,
that, but certainly
yeah.
it's something we all learn about in elementary school growing up, are the Salem witch trials. What did you discover? That initial, I guess, tinge of curiosity about how these panics mimic uh, what was it? Outbreaks, parasitic outbreaks. What was that initial discovery or aha moment that you came to as you started to dive in here?
Well, what I found very interesting about witch hunting is that many past historians thought that it was an intelligent design. They thought that people had shrewdly created this whole witch hunt system because it would benefit them. So they created it. For instance, the inquisitors, Catholic Inquisition, created it in order to gain more power, or men invented it in order to oppress women, or new city elites developed it to destroy traditional peasant culture. So all sorts of ideas about people using this very shrewdly. Yeah, and when I delved into the topic, I learned that many more recent historians argued that that was actually not really the case. It seems that people genuinely believed in the dangers of witchcraft, that witchcraft was something very real, and that this was what primarily drove the persecutions further. Um, yes, and I think they're right about that. I've read loads of books, and that's really what it looks like to me. People were genuinely afraid of witchcraft. But this whole system of witch hunting does indeed look like an intelligent design. It seems as if someone has shrewdly created it, because there are many ideas about witchcraft that made persecutions very big. And it looks as if someone has crafted it that way. So, for instance, people thought that witches met at nightly gatherings, so called witches' Sabbaths. They would come together, and if they believed to have found one witch, they would start torturing this person to make her, or sometimes also him, confess that they were a witch and to tell them who they had seen at the witches' Sabbath, because witches were supposed to know each other. So, this idea could stimulate chains of accusations, with one accusation leading to new confessions and accusations. Yeah, so that's an idea. Witches know each other from a witches' Sabbath that tended to stimulate large persecutions. And people also often thought, that witches could fly to witches' Sabbaths, for instance, on a broomstick. Um, and this implied that witches were supposed to know each other over long distances. Yeah, so they met each other at this Sabbath, they claimed from various places. And this often stimulated chains of accusations over long distances. Because when there was a witch hunt in one place or one town, they would inform people from other places, like, well, we've heard that people from your town also attended the witches' Sabbath
Mm.
in our town or near to our place. So it was almost like an outbreak. So it could start with one accusation, leading to an arrest, leading to confessions, and then just a snowballing process, potentially also spreading over long distances. Yeah, the question is, how did it evolve that way?
Yeah, and we certainly are no stranger to what that looks like here in the last, gosh, 3 years of how that chain of outbreak occurs. We experienced it. We lived it. We still are living it. I wanna go back to something you
Yeah.
said. Why is it important for the distinction between that these witch hunts were intelligently designed versus that this is something that people actually believed? Why is it important to make the distinction between the 2, Steije?
Because many past historians thought that, um, yeah, sort of under the veneer of a witch hunt, people were actually doing something else. So it was mostly used as an excuse. So the inquisitors, they just wanted to create a new enemy in order to become more powerful, or men just wanted to create this idea of the witch in order to oppress women. Um, yeah, and if you look at it as something that people genuinely believed and that they were genuinely panicking about, it's no longer this shrewd design. And that's also what the witch hunts look like if we carefully study how they occurred. Because if you would presume that it was an intelligent design, then you would expect quite systematic witch persecutions, targeting specific groups over other groups.
Mm.
But that's not what historians have found. It was quite erratic. So it could suddenly erupt somewhere, then disappear for a long while, suddenly erupt elsewhere. And again, that looks like genuine panics. So people really thought that witches were living in their midst and that they were extremely dangerous. They had allied themselves with the devil. They were performing harmful magic. So if you wouldn't stop them, that would mean big trouble.
And what did it take for someone, I guess, then to be accused? Who were the people that initially started the accusation, and who were they? I don't wanna use the word targeting because you said that's really not what they were doing, but what were the scenarios or the circumstances that surrounded someone being accused of being a witch?
Well, there were two common ways in which persecutions started. One was often suspicions of harmful magic within local communities. So, within villages or towns, there were often people, in many cases women, who had reputations for harmful magic. And these reputations, they could go back decades. And very often, for a long time, hardly anything happened, but people were gossiping about it. But then, for instance, after a very strange hailstorm or a child suddenly fell ill, then people might become more angry and think like, well, again, it was her. Now we really need to do something about this person. And they would go to the authorities and ask for a trial. And another common mechanism, especially in the late phase of witch hunting, was that it started with children because increasingly people started to believe that children can also be witches. So often it was their parents who took them to the witches' sabbaths. So people became very careful to listen to what children had to say. And of course, children can provide imaginative testimonies. Often they didn't really understand what the consequences were when they told stories about them being witches. But that could start a trial. So
Mm.
children were often the door openers, telling fanciful stories, getting a lot of attention. But then what could happen was that they would be suspected of witchcraft, then condemned for witchcraft, and burned alongside much of their family. For instance, if they named members from their family as accomplices.
What were the consequences of someone saying, "Look, this isn't what you think it is," and almost, I guess, defending the person accused? What would were there consequences for those folks?
It really depended on where it happened, because there were many places where people did not believe in witchcraft. Or where they thought these trials were very insecure. And this was also often very Christian. So people thought, well, we should love thy neighbor, and it's probably the devil who's playing with it, with us, creating illusions about witchcraft to make us
Hmm.
believe that these witches are real and to make us shed innocent blood. So very often, when there were accusations, authorities would not start a trial. Sometimes they were undecided. They really didn't know what to do. So sometimes they might even kill one person to appease the angry people, but would not go any further. So in those conditions, it could be very helpful if someone else would say, like, that's not a real witch. But at places where these panics were going on, with many people believing that this was real, and especially if the authorities believed it was real, then things could get out of hand completely. And if someone would say, well, witchcraft doesn't actually exist, that might be interpreted as an indication
Hmm.
that someone was a witch himself. Many supporters of witch trials also wrote that people who deny that witchcraft exists are probably witches themselves. Yeah, so that was quite a nasty mechanism that anyone who criticized it ran a risk of ending up at the stake themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the scope that we're talking about here when you describe these panics? How many people over what area? How many people are affected here with the panics that you've studied?
It started somewhere early 15th century in the Western Alps, and then gradually it spread, but not very much. Most people in Europe were still very skeptical about this whole thing, that it was a diabolical conspiracy. Yeah, and especially people thought that it was the devil, as I said, who created this illusion.
Hmm.
But things really started to change after around 1550, 1560. This was the period of the Little Ice Age. So it became a lot colder. Very strange weather conditions, like sudden frost late in spring. So people thought something strange was going on. There was also overpopulation, there were less resources. So people were probably in a more aggressive mood. It was also the period of the religious wars. So they were used to the idea that people within your own community can choose the wrong side. And the step towards violence had already become quite normal. So, in those conditions, people became a lot more vulnerable for this idea about a diabolical conspiracy with people living in their midst who had allied themselves with the devil and who were harming them, for instance, through hailstorms or strange frosts or illness. So, in those conditions, people became more vulnerable, and you can see a very significant rise in witch persecutions after 1550. And then it reached its peak around 1630, and then it gradually became less. And it ended in the 18th century, but probably up to 50, perhaps even 60,000 people in Europe and a small part of Northern America have been killed as alleged witches.
Hmm. So let's then bring this forward. Why is it important to understand this and look at these types of witchcraft panics in a modern lens? What does it tell us about today?
Um, well, a very strict historical answer would be this is what many historians will probably say is that the past is interesting in its own right. So it doesn't necessarily have to be relevant for us today. And to some extent, I agree with that. But obviously, I do think this is relevant for us today because I mean everything that happens today is very different from witch persecutions. You can always point at many differences, but at the same time, some of the mechanisms always sound familiar to people. So I think it can also help us better understand certain things that are occurring today.
What are some of those things that you point to and say, I see the same activity, I see the same mindset playing out?
Um, yeah, I'm going to be a little bit careful there because I mean,
Okay.
witch persecution was something very, very cruel. I mean, people were terribly tortured, burned, thousands of people died. So comparing something that's happening today or what people today are doing to this phenomenon is quite crude. So I would rather say it might be certain mechanisms that are familiar to me when I look at things that are happening today. Yeah, for instance, one thing that in certain respects can look a bit similar are all these conspiracy theories that are going on in today's world. For instance, in the US, this QAnon
Mm-hmm.
conspiracy, it tells us that certain politicians have hijacked children and have sexual intercourse with them. And I think um, an idea like this becomes really well adapted to make people in particular contexts afraid. So, for instance, the idea, if you look at some staunch Republicans, they might think Democratic politicians are corrupt. So, the idea that they are involved in networks of pedophiles, that's really like the most disgusting thing ever.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that the conspiracy theories adapt in ways uh, that make people really afraid and angry. And the concept of witchcraft in the early modern period, in the 16th and 17th centuries, that concept was also very well adapted to make people angry and to make them scared. So, for instance, there was the idea that the devil makes a pact with people, women in particular, through sex.
Hmm.
So, within the context of its time, that was really like the most terrible, appalling thing that could happen, like women having sex with the devil. So, the ideas were really adapted to what people in that context found absolutely terrible. Um, yeah, and sometimes I also see somewhat similar mechanisms. Yeah, my colleagues really normally don't like it when I say this, but what's sometimes called the woke movement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and there are many dimensions that I sympathize with, but it's stimulating a lot of conflict, also in the Netherlands now. And this is also something that the witchcraft ideology did. So, very trivial things that could happen between people, like a cow that fell ill, were suddenly translated into an epic battle against evil. Like a cow fell ill, that is not just a cow that falls ill, but something very extreme. Namely, the devil is behind this and he has allies. So, a big conflict could start over just a tiny event. Yeah, for instance, in the Netherlands, we have a political party that's very much into this ideology, and they have constant conflicts amongst each other. So, for instance, there was a conflict when one person asked another person, "What do you like to cook for dinner?" But this stimulated huge conflicts because people said, "Well, as a man, you should not ask a woman what she wants to cook for dinner." But
Okay.
then there was even more anger because those two people said, well, you as white people are telling us that we're not supposed to ask other people what they like to cook for dinner, which is white supremacy, because in our culture, it's perfectly fine to ask such questions.
Hmm. So
And I
these,
think yeah,
I was gonna say, so these perhaps seemingly innocuous interactions, or not often um, voiced in the right way, perhaps, are taken into this enormous conflict that it gets blown out of
yeah,
proportion, and that rather than assuming positive intent of the person, we assume the worst of them. Am I getting the
yes,
drift there?
yeah, exactly. And the idea is that uh, cultural phenomena can evolve in order to have that effect. So if we look at the case of witch hunts, this whole ideology stimulated enormous conflict. So communities could really be ravaged by witch hunts, with hardly anyone benefited or no one benefiting. Because in quite some cases, even the people who persecuted themselves could lose their members of their own family or end up at the stake themselves. So it's very difficult to say who amongst the people there really benefited from this. But uh, the ideology had become very well adapted to stimulate the conflicts because conflicts create a lot of news. So, for instance, in the late 16th century, there was an unusually big witch persecution in the Trier region in Germany, in Western Germany. It was the first place where they killed hundreds of people. So, it stimulated huge conflicts. And that, of course, was sensational news. So many people were reading about it.
Hmm.
And the ideas that made that persecution so big, for instance, the idea that children can also be witches and that they are likely suspects, those ideas spread, stimulating similar conflicts elsewhere. So, stimulating conflict can stimulate a lot of news coverage with other people adopting the ideas. So, even if and that's a bit virus like. So, a virus can also spread through people. And even if the people themselves suffer the consequences, that doesn't necessarily matter because the virus keeps spreading. And what I've examined is that this can also happen to cultural ideas. They can become adapted to make or to create conflicts with all the people suffering the consequences, but the ideas themselves living for another day or surviving for another day.
We certainly see that. You referenced QAnon. I had a former QAnon believer, I guess I should say, here on the show, and she said exactly what you've been saying. It's driven by fear. You genuinely believe these things because there's a fear about what's next, or what's happening to your family, where the country's going, what you see as right versus wrong. I've got to go back to something you said when you mentioned, like, no one appears to have substantially benefited from these, but there does seem to be people who stoke these fears, who do invest in helping the idea spread. What role do they play? Even if, gosh, even if they don't benefit, what role do they play?
If you look at it from a sort of a viral perspective, you might see them as super spreaders. So the idea has entered their minds and it made them very motivated to spread it. For instance, there's an analogy to the rabies virus. This enters the brains of dogs and it really then determines their behavior. So they get a foaming mouth, they become very restless, aggressive, they want to
Mhm,
bite.
mhm.
But all the behavior is very harmful for the dog. But it's very good for the reproduction of the rabies virus. So an idea like QAnon, I mean, certain people might lose their friends and suffer many consequences, but they are still very motivated to spread it. It doesn't mean that nobody will ever benefit, because in the case of the witch hunts, you can certainly find some examples of people who, to a certain extent, benefited from it, who might have used it to get rid of some sort of enemy or who made a bit of money as a persecutor. But that really can't explain the scale of what happened in Europe. And in many cases, the all involved actors suffered the consequences.
Why is it helpful to view this through the lens of, or to compare it to a parasitic outbreak, to a virus? What does it what does it do in helping deepen our understanding of these kinds of ideas?
Well, one of the things that's important, I think, is that you shouldn't assume that there are very bad people behind very bad phenomena, or it doesn't have to be that way. So when many people looked at the witch persecutions, they thought something very spooky, very terrible was going on. There must have been bad guys operating behind the scenes.
Mhm.
But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be that way. I mean, bad people, of course, do exist. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's an important lesson when we study historical phenomena, but also phenomena today. And secondly, it can help us understand how they evolve. Because many historians said, well, witch hunting was a dysfunctional phenomenon. Communities were disrupted, even the witch hunters suffered the consequences. Obviously, the people who were persecuted as witches greatly suffered. So it was something dysfunctional. However, when you look at it from the angle of the witch hunting phenomenon as a cultural virus or an epidemic disease, suddenly it makes total functional sense. because the beliefs about witchcraft were extremely functionally organized to make and keep people hunting for witches. So you suddenly recognize a certain functional rationale behind something, behind the cultural phenomena. And in today's world, I think this might help us combat such phenomena.
What were those things that helped keep the spread going, like you just mentioned there?
Mhm. What were those things?
Yeah, what
Was the
were those
question.
things? Yeah, what were those things that kept the virus spreading,
Yeah, so
sometimes out of
the
control?
idea of the witches' Sabbath, the idea that witches knew each other, stimulated those chains of accusations. The idea that I mentioned that children could be witches.
Mhm.
So when that idea came into being, it stimulated new persecutions that many people were reading about or telling others about. So the idea of child witches spread, uh, stimulating many new persecutions at other places. Because an adult is very unlikely to tell people about their visits to a witch's Sabbath because they understand the consequences, namely the death penalty.
Mhm.
But children often didn't understand this. So they were just telling told tales about their visits to the witch's Sabbath. And also, it was important that the belief became adapted to make people interpret anything that happened as a confirmation of their belief. So, for instance, if there was an absence of evidence, that was also evidence because the devil, the demons, and his witches really took care to hide the evidence. And for instance, when people were accused of witchcraft and a trial started, sometimes when these suspects saw the torture machines or all the tools that people at the time had at their disposal, they would immediately confess that they were witches. And to the witch hunters, that was a confirmation. Like, you see, there are witches.
Mm.
But there were also people who were tortured for a very long time and still refused to confess. For instance, in one German city, there was a woman named Barbara Schwarz. She has been tortured for 1.5 years, but still refused to confess. And according to the persecutors, this could not happen under normal conditions, survive torture for such a long time. So demons had to be involved there.
Mm.
It was demonic assistance that enabled Barbara Schwartz to withstand torture for such a long time. So when people confessed quickly or not, in both scenarios, this confirmed that people were on the right track, that this danger was very urgent. Yeah, for instance, when people responded emotionally when they were accused of witchcraft, that was very suspicious. But if people did not respond emotionally, that was also extremely suspicious.
My
Yeah, so it was
gosh.
very difficult to protect yourself against such accusations.
It speaks to confirmation bias, right? We go looking for the
Yeah,
evidence to support what we already believe to be true in our heart of hearts. Then that
yeah.
begs the question, Staya, how does it begin to how to use the to stay on the parasitic or the outbreak verbiage here, how do we begin to inoculate ourselves? How did it go from the height of the 1630s, I believe you said, but, trails off into the 18th century? What happened? How did people begin to come out of this mode of confirmation bias, of fear, of seeing what you want to believe?
Um, well, what happened from around 1590 onwards is that almost all groups in society were targeted. So in the first phase, it was often, or the early phase, it was often women who were in quite some cases rather poor. But in the late 16th century, the idea became more prevalent that anyone could be a witch. So even rich people, men, children, and initially this stimulated many more big persecutions because it stimulated huge persecutions that got a lot of attention, and thus new similar trials occurred elsewhere. So it was sort of a short term strategy from the perspective of this cultural virus. On the short term, it stimulated the survival of witch hunting or the spread. But in the long run, it implied that many more groups in society became skeptical about it. People became more open minded about the idea that something went wrong here. When so many people were killed, very often people that others had known to be very decent people,
Hmm.
and also more books were written against witch hunting. For instance, there was a priest in Germany, Friedrich von Spee, who wrote a big book in which he said this is just an illusion. Yeah, so that was starting to have an impact. And also, people decided that judicial procedures needed to become more careful. Especially the use of torture was very much contested at the time. So nobody would contest that demons were very important or that perhaps witchcraft was possible. But what was very much criticized was the use of torture in order to extract confessions. So already at the time, people said, well, then you do get confessions, but it's not because they're real, but because people are tortured. Yeah, and the defense against that was that because witch hunting was somewhat divine, God would not allow torture sessions to produce false confessions. But that argument became more difficult to sustain when many people who had persecuted witches themselves also ended up at the stake. So gradually, the whole argument began to collapse when it made so many victims. It sort of overplayed its hand, one might say.
One of the questions that has gone through my mind as I was reading up on the work you've done and preparing for this is, in comparing these kinds of outbreaks, mind viruses perhaps, to parasitic outbreaks. How do you account for humans going off script? Like,
Mhm.
I can look at a virus and how it spreads and apply, perhaps, yes, there are variants that occur that could be tied into humans going off script, but yeah, how do you account for the human element of this that eventually somebody steps up and says, "You know what? I know that person. They're not a witch. This is not right what we're doing." How do you account for that?
Um, Yeah, I think there are multiple dimensions to that. One is that there are always competing ideas. So, for instance, as I said before, there was the competing idea that witch hunting was a creation of the devil. So he created illusions in people's minds. And after a huge wave of witch hunts around 1630, people became more susceptible to this idea. Like, haven't we been tricked by the devil? That so many people in our city have died. Wasn't this some sort of very bad diabolical idea?
Mm.
So there were constantly also sort of cultural tools that enabled people to be more critical. Or, for instance, the Christian notion of love thy neighbor. That was, as far as I can tell, hardly used by witch hunters, but it was used, for instance, by this priest, Friedrich von Spee. Um, yeah, so I think there are always alternative cultural tools that can help us resist such ideas. And at the same time, I think people are still have free will and can always think for themselves. What decisions should I make? And I think there has never really been an excuse for witch hunting because even within the context of its time, I think people could and should have known better. Because already by the standards of the time, it was quite questionable, witch hunting. Because as many critics said, well, you can't really be sure about this, and in cases of uncertainty, you should not decide to burn people. And also by the standards of the time, I mean, it was very uncertain what was going on.
So what you just said, how okay, we could and should have known better. I think we've all probably voiced that either to ourselves or more specifically, or perhaps more pointedly about others. They should know better. They could know better. They just choose not to. We assign those labels to folks. How do we what's the question I'm trying to ask? How do we push through that wanting to assign that label of you should know better, you could know better to actually bring about an opening of eyes, a realization of what's actually in front of you, a presentation of the evidence? How do we navigate through that you could and should do this and what we know to be true? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense because I think people will, when they hear about this theory, they will probably think, oh, yeah, the others suffer from a mind parasite, but not me.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think we shouldn't be too sure of that. We might suffer from something like this ourselves. Yeah, so how do you recognize it? Well, it's usually difficult because those ideas are usually very well adapted to make us really believe it. Um, yeah, so how do you recognize that you might have a mind parasite in your own mind? Yeah, for instance, when you're no longer willing to listen to counter voices, I think that is a very alarming signal because surely witch hunters did not want to listen to counter voices
Mhm.
because those people were probably witches themselves.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, if you no longer really approve of standards of evidence, because the witch hunters usually thought that they were right and they didn't really need the standards of evidence or careful procedures anymore, which witchcraft also became known as a crimen acceptum, a crime that was so very terrible that the normal regulations on the use of torture or proof could be disbanded.
Mm.
So I think that might also be an indication that when other people ask for proof, you say something like, "Why on earth would you ask for proof? On whose side are you on? We already know what's going on here."
Right.
If you argue like that, I think that might be an indication.
So then let's bring it forward to the modern day if we can, just as we begin to wrap things up here. Um, Certainly we've talked with Andy Norman and on this show. I've had him on twice now. The idea of mental immunity, cognitive immunity. Uh, what do you see as, the lessons that we can learn from this and apply to today? What are the things that we can do to build up that immunity so that those ideas where we say, I don't need evidence, I know this to be true. Um, what can we do? How can we apply what you've studied and what you know about these witch hunts and apply them to today?
Um, yeah, one thing, of course, might be simply to study sociocultural phenomena from this perspective. As one of the pioneers of this approach said, it was an anthropologist, Ted Cloak. He said, "If we are the slaves of some of our cultural traits, isn't it time we knew it?
Hmm.
Because if we learn to recognize them, it might make it more easy to defend ourselves against such mind parasites." Um, yeah, and always be open minded about counter voices. Yeah, and I sympathize with this whole idea of the follow up question. I think that also helps. Um, yeah, and always be careful about standards of proof. That never think like we really know what's going on here. We no longer need proof for allegations against certain people.
Right, right.
Yeah, you always need proof, even if you really, really, really think you're on the right side of history.
Understood. Well, Staya, what question do you wish you were asked more? Either about this topic or just in general. I'd love to hear your perspective on this question.
Um, yeah, it's perhaps about the fact that this theory is quite controversial amongst historians. They usually really don't like it.
Why not?
Yeah, it was extremely difficult to get it funded. It was eventually a lady of very advanced age who funded my research because I've been trying to get it funded for many, many years. Historians were extremely skeptical, and also sociologists or anthropologists. There's people from neighboring disciplines. Yeah, so there were many failed attempts, but at some point, this lady, I think at the time she was already 89, sent me an email in response to an article that I wrote about this. And I conversed with her through email. And at some point, she started about a fund that she had created from a huge legacy that she received. And from this fund, my research has finally been subsidized.
Wow.
Yeah, and now I think she's 95 or 96. So fortunately, she could still attend my PhD defense ceremony.
That's awesome. I'm just struck by in that scenario and saying that, many people were against it. Going back to what you just said, don't be afraid of the counter voice,
Yeah.
the counter argument. But why? What were people running up against? Was it this notion that these things had to be planned out and diabolical in nature?
Well, historians are very skeptical about using ideas from the natural sciences, and especially biology.
Uh,
Yeah, they think history is something really, really different, and it should be studied with its own methodology. So don't adopt ideas from the natural sciences. Yeah, and people are also a bit afraid, and I think there are also some good reasons for that. Afraid of Darwinism, because in the past a lot of bad stuff has happened with Darwinism. For instance, in the late 19th, early 20th century, many people were inspired by the idea of the survival of the fittest. So, for instance, in the USA, there were these eugenic programs
mhm.
sterilizing the weak. So that's something people often associate Darwinian theory with, and I do sympathize with the skepticism to some extent. But I think this theory is really about something else, namely not the survival of the fittest with regard to humans, weak or strong humans, but ideas. It concerns the selection of variants of culture. So I think it's a very different thing, but still there is so much skepticism as a consequence of sort of the old harsh social Darwinism. Yeah, so that also has been a significant barrier.
Yeah, I'm curious, just a quick follow-up question to that. What is what is the argument for keeping the study of history and the study of the natural things separate? Why is that so important to folks out there in the field of work that you do?
Well, there have been many attempts in the past to study history along the lines of the natural sciences, to look for big laws that really help us explain history and even to make predictions. And then it always turned out that history is actually far more complex, that you can't find these really big laws, that you always have to study historical phenomena in its own very particular complex historical context. There are
Mhm.
always many exceptions for any, too many exceptions for any general rule to work. So I do sympathize with that argument, but I think if you look at living nature is also extremely complex, and things constantly adapt to their own very particular circumstances. So I think the difference in that regard is not that big, and I'm not looking for a huge law that will help us make very deterministic predictions. We always have to look at a very complex and specific context if we want to understand or study a specific historical phenomenon.
I appreciate the tip of the cap, the nod to the counter argument there, Staya. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I appreciate just this is super interesting and just understanding your work and hearing you explain it and how it could possibly explain some things that we're going through today. So thank you so much for being willing to jump on here. I appreciate it and best wishes to you. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to take part in this. Thank you.
As we wrap up this episode, I want to draw your attention to something Staya said that really, when I went back and listened to this episode, shook me. And it is this. He said, "You shouldn't assume that there are very bad people behind very bad phenomena, or it doesn't have to be that way." Think about that for a second. There's a lot of really bad stuff happening, and not all of it is attached to bad people working behind the scenes to inflict or bring about this bad phenomena on our enemies or on the people that we deem other than us. take a step back and perhaps read news headlines or articles or watch the news and just see how often this is the case, that something bad happens that perhaps we can't explain, or that it perhaps appears or seems a little bit out of our control, and we automatically go looking for people to blame. And yes, while mistakes might happen, while there might be some human element or involvement there, it's not always because they are bad actors. This is certainly the case as we look back at the witchcraft panics that Steije is an expert in. And I'll be blunt here. Look at how so much of our response has been to the COVID-19 pandemic. They mirror each other in so many ways. Take a step back and see how these phenomena are recreating themselves just in different ways. And realize that you're not going to force somebody to change their mind about this. You have to invite in a deeper level of conversation, one where you set aside your ego, one where you set aside your need to be right and certain, and you dig underneath the surface and get to the fear that exists, even if it's admitted or not. So I want to thank Steije for joining me here on this episode of The Follow-Up Question. Please share this episode with someone you know, someone in your network who might find this conversation as fascinating as I did, and hopefully as you did as well. Also, subscribe to the show so that you never miss when a new episode with an incredible guest like Steije, when it drops, so that you can be the first to listen and get it right there on your podcast player wherever you are listening. Also, do me a favor. I've started a YouTube channel, so jump over to YouTube, search my name, Michael Ashford, and my channel will come up, and subscribe there. I'm trying to invest a little bit more time there in terms of pushing out more content from the show, content from myself as well that you don't hear on the show. So please go take a look at YouTube and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to my website, michaelashford.com, and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.